Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Conversations on Groong episode. Dr. Pietro Shakarian joins us today. He is a historian of Russia and the Soviet Union, currently based in St. Petersburg, Russia. We're going to be discussing the recent Russian-Iranian strategic partnership that was signed in mid-January and how it might affect Armenia and its region. We're also going to touch on the latest political updates from the war in Ukraine.
This will be an exciting episode, folks, so please stay tuned. But first, thank you for following us. As always, we're always happy to earn your support. You can do that through Buy Me a Coffee, Patreon, and you can learn through all the different ways you can support us by going to podcasts.groong.org/donate. Please consider doing that and become a sustaining member. And if you can't donate to us monetarily, you will do us a great favor by adding a comment, liking our podcast, and sharing our podcast with your friends and your social network. We would truly appreciate that. So please don't hesitate to do that and help us out. And thank you. And on with the show.
Dr. Pietro Shakarian, welcome to the show.
Well, great to be back, Asbed. Great to be back, Hovik. It's swell to be here, guys.
Ողջույն, Pietro, or should I say привет,
Barev. Vontes. Shadlab?
Shadlab, hoyakap, hoyakap.
Отлично. Хорошо.
Last week, you published a detailed overview of the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Treaty that was inked by the Iranian and Russian presidents in Moscow on January 17. Now, this is a pretty comprehensive agreement with 47 articles and covering a wide scope of areas of cooperation and collaboration between the two countries. For everybody listening, Dr. Shakarian's analysis is published by the American Committee for U.S.-Russia Accord and antiwar.com, and we've put the links in our show notes, which you can find at podcasts.groong.org/episode number. This treaty was signed just 3 days before Donald Trump took office in the White House for the second term as President of the United States. Pietro, what was the need for this treaty? Why did they need to sign this?
Well, I think, first of all, thank you for having me on again to discuss this. But we have to consider the fact that this treaty really codified developments that have been kind of percolating in Russian-Iranian relations in recent decades, but specifically in the last 10 years, right? I mean, they got especially close in the last 10 years, and particularly since not only since the war in Syria, but also since the invasion of Ukraine, since the beginning of the war in Ukraine in 2022, and with the special military operation in Ukraine. And many different factors brought Russia and Iran closer together, many different theaters of conflict. So again, we have now most recently Gaza. We also have the situation with Ukraine, Syria, Artsakh, various fronts, in Eurasia that have actually brought Russia and Iran closer together. Plus, there are also two countries that are very much sanctioned. So this is also another important point. And also there is a history there. It's a history that's not, it's not necessarily entirely positive, because we also know that there were wars between Russia and Iran, right? This is how Eastern Armenia became part of the Russian Empire, beginning really with the province of Luri in 1801, with the Kingdom of Georgia coming into the Russian Empire, but also especially 1828 with Yerevan and Echmiadzin and these areas becoming part of the Russian Caucasus, and also Artsakh before, actually, in the 1813 Treaty of Gulistan. So it's a long history that goes back. But I mean, if we're talking about the most recent events, it's really kind of rooted in the last 10 to 20 years, actually even you could say 30 years, that Russia and Iran have become particularly close in their relations.
Yeah. Well, so in any international treaty, probably the most important aspect is the defense component. Wide areas of military and intelligence and technology cooperation are covered in this agreement. Yet you and also many other observers have noted that this agreement is not a so-called military alliance. What would make an agreement a military alliance? And also, why is this agreement not one?
Well, first of all, a military alliance would assume that, we got your back no matter what. So if you're attacked, then we'll come and, come to your rescue and intervene to protect you in this case. That there would be a pact that would unequivocally state that if you are attacked or invaded, we'll come in and we'll help you out, right? This is like how the Russia-North Korean treaty, let's say, is structured. But with Iran, it's a different case. Iran, there is deep cooperation in the military sphere, actually. As envisioned by this treaty. It's extremely deep. And the treaty actually really forms a framework for deepening that relationship even more. But it comes just shy of being a alliance, in the sense that there is a very important article where they do discuss this issue of kind of mutual support. So really, we're talking about Article 3.
Yeah.
And Article 3, really what this does is it, kind of has like a mutual agreement on, sovereign equality, territorial integrity, which also is very important, again, when we talk about the history of Iranian-Russian relations. We look at the Iran crisis in 1946. But also there is this really important section of Article 3, which is really this idea that it prohibits the parties from supporting potential aggressors. So in case Iran is attacked, the treaty does not oblige Russia to come to Iran's defense, but Russia is obliged by the treaty not to support the country that is attacking Iran, right? So this is actually also quite interesting, that it stops just short of a direct military alliance.
Can you talk a little bit more about those components of the defense agreement a little bit that you said are present in Article 3?
This is present. This is actually Article 3. And there's Section 1, and Section 1 is, again, that kind of mutual exchange on non-interference in internal affairs, kind of laying that out there. But Section 3 is the one that says that basically prohibits the parties from supporting potential aggressors in the case of an attack.
Right, but what about the really technical components, like cross-training and maybe military, like drone technologies and things like that?
That's not in this. That's not in this specific article yet. That actually comes much later on. When we talk about Article 5, that's when they go into the deep, nitty-gritty of military technical cooperation. They envision mutual military exercises. They talk about this idea of consultations. Actually, that's actually in Article 6, Section 2. Where they talk about kind of annual meetings on military technical cooperation. Right. There have even been some analyses that have been even saying that this treaty has nothing on military technical cooperation. I even read an article, one analysis in RT, even of all places, where it says there's nothing in here about military technical cooperation. And I thought, well, that's kind of unusual, because when you read the treaty and you read it in Russian, it's very clear what the text means. But it's not necessarily, again, this idea that if you're attacked, then we got your back 100%.
Okay.
I mean, they do. It's like an indirect support. There's indirect support. I shouldn't say that they would leave Iran in the lurch. There's kind of this, kind of subtle kind of indirect support, that we wouldn't support the aggressor, that we would, call for, that we would, engage in consultations and so on and so forth. But this is not yet something that we would call an alliance, but it is something that's very close to that. It's a comprehensive, all-around treaty that covers many different facets, not just military. I mean, military is, of course, the most interesting one for many people, many political observers. But it's so much more than that. I mean, even it gets down to, like I said in the article, in the analysis, even the promotion of Persian literature and language in Russia. This is also something that's significant too, because Russia has a long-standing kind of cultural interest in Iran. There's a very strong tradition of, Iranian studies in Russia, and also before in the Soviet Union, and actually even before in the Russian Empire. And so this is kind of a natural, kind of partnership between these two countries. It's been around. I mean, it's been something that has been developing for centuries. And even before certainly the 19th century that we always look at, or 18th century even, when we talk about Peter the Great's Caspian campaign.
What I would like to draw the attention of our listeners is another article that you talk about, which is Article 12. And that one talks about let me just read it because it's short. The contracting party shall facilitate bolstering of peace and security in the Caspian region, Central Asia, Transcaucasia, and the Middle East, cooperate to prevent interference in the specified regions and destabilizing presence of third states there, and exchange opinions on the situation in other regions of the world. So it's basically staking out the Caspian region, Central Asia, Transcaucasia, and the Middle East as areas of mutual interest and areas where interference from external actors is unwelcome. Now, when we talk about Transcaucasia or the South Caucasus specifically, let's look at Armenia and Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan has extensively close relationships with Israel. I mean, I would put Turkey in there as well, but I don't know if Russia and Iran view Turkey as an external entity, but we can talk about that. And Armenia is making strides to increase its relationship with the United States. It signed recently a so-called strategic partnership days before Trump took office. It has the EU observer mission, which draws the ire of almost everyone in the region. And it also has green-lighted this referendum for joining the EU.
And it's also the other important thing to mention about that, Hovik, because they're doubling down on it. So the assumption was in the Russian kind of analytical sphere, this idea was that maybe Pashinyan might be doing these moves because he's under pressure from the Biden administration. Well, when the Biden administration now is gone, and that pressure supposedly is lifted, he's doubling down on this. That's what's so interesting to the Russian observers.
But essentially, talk about Chapter 12 and how Iranians view this external interference. And essentially, they have codified that they don't like external interference as part of this treaty. So what does that really mean? And given Armenia's and Azerbaijan's geopolitical orientations, what can Russia and Iran do about that?
Well, basically what this treaty is codifying, it's putting on paper, is this idea that, Russia and Iran are basically saying, we're the cops on the beat. And we're going to make sure that there is no third-party intervention in this region, that we want to keep this region, to be the region of, let's say, the Caucasians or the Central Asians, or, I guess you could say people of the Caspian area. Now, that's actually what's so significant to me when I look at the text of this. So when people think about Russian-Iranian relations, especially in the West, Hovik, they think about the Middle East. They think about Syria, right? Syria, we know what happened there, right? And the Middle East actually is not such a big thrust of this treaty. It came up in the press conference. When you have Putin and Pezeshkian there in the press conference, the point came up about the Middle East, like it was mentioned 6 times, because again, people are concerned about, especially the Iranian side in particular, is really mentioning this issue of Gaza, of Palestine, of what's going on there. But fundamentally, if you look at the text of the treaty, the main overarching areas of focus are those of Eurasia. So we're talking, and that's actually what's interesting to me, and this is a point that's missed by many commentators, but it's extraordinarily important, which is the Eurasia focus of the treaty, which is to say Caucasus, Central Asia, and the Caspian region, So that's Article 12, as Sergei Markidanov said in its recent analysis, this is an article of fundamental importance. The fact that you have Russia's leading scholar of the Caucasus, who teaches at McGimo, writing that, means that that's really significant, that he's emphasizing, underlying, underscoring, whatever term you want to use, how important Article 12 is. And yet Article 12 has been missed by so many of these analysts who are looking at it. They think about sanctions, they think about, Middle East, they think about the military aspect. Is this an alliance? Is it not? But Article 12 is so fundamental to this treaty. And building on that, Article 13, which nobody talks about, right? Article 13 is squarely focused on the Caspian region. 4 sections. It's a whole article with 4 sections on the Caspian region, which really indicates to me, first of all, it makes sense, right? Because this is a common body of water for both Russia and Iran. All right, that's clear. But also, it's the fact that the Caspian region is also an area of interest for, let's say, kind of the Western war parties, for also Western big energy interests, right? They want to get into this region. Again, they have the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline. BP, British Petroleum, has a 30% stake in the BTC. Let that sink in for our viewers and our listeners. A 30% stake. That's pretty substantial, right? And after the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh, if you might recall, Aliyev's first meeting was with the CEO of BP, right? So this is quite significant. And what I believe this is also aimed at is preventing the realization of a Trans-Caspian pipeline, which would extend the BTC across the Caspian Sea to Turkmenistan, which has the 4th or 5th largest reserves of natural gas in the world. And beyond Turkmenistan, there's also Uzbekistan, there's also Kazakhstan. These are energy-rich countries. Even when I say that they're energy-rich, even this is an understatement. And, you know, the Western war interests, the big oil, they have a big interest in this region to undermine Russia's geopolitical position, and also Iran's, and also ultimately China's, because Central Asia adjoins China, right, in that big picture. So that, in addition, of course, to the Caucasus and Central Asia, is so fundamental to this treaty. And Article 12 is also explicitly saying, this is something that, like I said, both Pashinyan and Aliyev should be, you know, paying close attention to. That it's basically saying that you guys can't be bringing in these foreign forces into the region. And also in particular for Aliyev, when we talk about Azerbaijan, the role of Israel in this whole picture is quite significant. There's also the aspect too, the emphasis on the territorial integrity issue. And this goes back to kind of the earlier articles we were discussing before, right? But territorial integrity is so fundamentally important for large, what we call civilizational states like Russia and Iran, large multi-ethnic states where you know, certain interests, let's say, might want to stir up like ethnic secessionist sentiments, right? And Iran has a whole history of this, you know, unfortunately, as we know, in relation to Russia and the Soviet Union with the Iran crisis of 1946 with the Azerbaijani and Kurdish republics. So even that we can say actually is like a symbolic gesture on the part of Russia, that they're saying, we're not going to intervene in your foreign affairs. We're not going to support separatist activities on our territory. They're almost like conceding that, you know what, we know we did wrong to you in the past, and we're not going to do that again. And we're going to, moreover, work with you very closely to make sure that nothing like this happens to you. And for on the Russian side, it also is quite relevant because you have pundits and even Western politicians. You have, you know, Western politicians. Kaja Kallas of Estonia is basically openly said that we should seek the breakup of Russia. Right. So you think about this, that for both Russia and Iran on so many points, this treaty is so significant. But those two articles, Article 12 and Article 13, they fundamentally define the treaty as a treaty that is a Eurasian treaty. Middle East is mentioned too, of course, but the Caucasus, Central Asia, and the Caspian, which got its own article. It has its own article with 4 sections. Think about that significance. That's. I mean, I look at that. I look at this not only, by the way, as a political analyst. I look at this as a historian because I've worked with, you know, documents in the Russian archives. I've worked, you know, I have a book coming out, you know. So I look at this through a historian's lens, and the fact that they devote a whole article with 4 sections to a region, that means business. That really means business to me.
Pietro, I think also related to this is Article 21, which puts emphasis on the international north-south trade corridor, INSTIC, which would go through those regions that you talk about, which I assume is one of the reasons why they're so important as foundational in the treaty. We know that Russia and Iran are relying on rail communications via Azerbaijan. So that's the main route of the Instik, which is through and Rasht Astara. Basically, that segment of the railway is the only one that hasn't been built yet. And we know that they made some announcements that they're coming closer to, securing that, and getting closer to the finish line on that, although I'd like to know how much. In addition, the treaty mentions expansion of cooperation on gas communication. And a few days later, on January 20, the Russian government announced that it would build a new gas pipeline to Iran with the capacity of up to 55 billion cubic meters per year. And this would also go through presumably Azerbaijan. I think that's explicitly mentioned. My concern as an Armenian, with the new emphasis on Rasht Astara and now the gas pipeline, does this strategic deal increase the strategic importance of Azerbaijan as well for both Russia and Iran? And how will this be reflected in relations between Armenia and Azerbaijan?
Well, the biggest problem here, I mean, the biggest issue with this, kind of north-south corridor, I mean, this is something that Russia and Iran, first and foremost, they're looking for logistically what is, the kind of the fastest route between our two countries, right? And so that's one reason why Azerbaijan is appealing to them. It's also significant because while a lot of the focus on Azerbaijan in Western analyses is on the energy that they have, on their energy resources that they have, this also shows that in Russian eyes, and also to some extent Iranian eyes, that the real value of the country is its geographical position. Just like it goes back to kind of, again, 1720s with Peter the Great and his interest in the Caspian coast, that actually is the main reason why Azerbaijan would be kind of more interesting to kind of Russia and Iran now. Now, it doesn't necessarily mitigate the significance of Armenia. Armenia is also quite important for these countries too. In particular, if we look at Article 14, one of the points that they make in the treaty is that we want to expand, enhance trade, really, between Iran and the Eurasian Union. That's one of the declared goals. And Armenia has the only overland link between the Eurasian Union and Iran. Now, that could be jeopardized if Pashinyan leaves the Eurasian Union, if Armenia leaves the Eurasian Union, because, I mean, Russian officials are already interpreting Pashinyan, if he moves toward the EU and integrates in the EU, Russia will perceive that as the withdrawal of Armenia from the Eurasian Union. And that's actually quite interesting because it almost seems like as if, on one level, Pashinyan is trying to cut that tie between Iran and the Eurasian Union in a political sense, whereas Aliyev wants to do it in a more of an aggressive military sense. But they both seem to have the same idea in a different way, of course. That both these leaders, Baku and Yerevan, they both want to cut off Iran and Russia. And that's actually probably how it's viewed in Moscow and Tehran. I would be willing to bet any money on it that's how it's perceived. Now, in terms of the decision why they would do this, there is definitely the risk that if you build this pipeline through Azerbaijan, it's going to not only enhance necessarily their value, but also would it strengthen their clout? Would it strengthen their swagger? Because right now, as we know, Aliyev is extraordinarily he's on, I guess we could say, a victory high, but extraordinarily arrogant as a leader. And also Russia is aware of this too, and especially because we see what happened recently with the plane incident. Aliyev was jumping out of his skin to declare that Russia had shot down the plane over Grozny, right? This Azerbaijani flight that, crashed, as we know.
He wanted the people who did the shooting to be punished, basically, to be jailed.
I think it's more than that. I think is it more posturing in terms of relations between Russia and Iran? Because
I think maybe it is, but but I'm looking at how the Russians view it. I'm not looking at what Aliyev's intention is. Aliyev, he's like a two-bit thug. I mean, he really does not. I mean, at the end of the day, to me, he counts less than what the Russian perception of his behavior is. Because if we look at I guess let's look at international politics like the jungle, right? Because now we're looking at a world where we're talking about, Trump and Greenland, and we're talking about all these issues potentially where, the strongest win in the international arena. This is kind of a new idea that's being thrown out there, right? And if we look at the Caucasus, right? that really Russia is an apex predator. Iran is an apex predator in that part of the world. So for me, Aliyev, he's like a two-bit thug. He's, he wants to be a bigger guy than he is. He thinks he has
But
Turkey's
his
back.
behavior sort of told us that he wanted certain concessions. And, I'd be interested in what kind of concessions.
Let me spell it out. Aliyev wants to take a certain corridor, and Putin is so far against it, and he's making all these hissy fits in order to pressure, to get some acquiescence from Russia. Let me just also mention another fact, which is like, I think it was pretty insulting to Putin when he went to Davos and took these, cozying up with Zelensky right next to him.
Yeah, and he was smiling. He was grinning ear to ear when he was meeting with Zelensky. And I think, and actually the Russians, they see all this. They're taking notes. They're very methodical. They play a long game. And I think that, and also certainly Iran even more so, because Iran is right there on the front line. And they have this whole history of Azerbaijan, basically, as I wrote in my piece, where they promote irredentism against Iran. They promote the idea that Iranian Azerbaijan is southern Azerbaijan, right? That we were one whole Azerbaijan that was divided between Russia and Iran, which in the historiography, that's complete nonsense, but this is what they say. And this idea, actually, this is promoted by so-called scholars in the West, like I cited in my article, like the Atlantic Council's Brenda Schaefer. Now think about that, the Atlantic Council, right? This is not Russia's favorite institution by any means, okay? And look who's there. The queen of caviar diplomacy. So the Russians know about the situation, but I think that when we look at this idea of let's run the pipeline through Azerbaijan, the calculus is maybe we can use this to maybe kind of control Aliyev. He'll be a little bit less, crazy, right? If we have this, he would be a little bit less brazen if he has this pipeline going through him, and he knows that there's money in that, and that there's trade relations in that. But I think that, in my point of view, they should be very, very wary of that, because again, it has echoes of what happened with Turkey, where the Russians were helping, the Turkey. They were saying, Turkey, we want to help develop you into a gas hub. Now you're hearing that in relation to Iran. Russia's talking about that in relation to Iran, which is interesting. No more do you hear about that with Turkey. But after the events in Syria, basically Turkey was saying effectively, look, you are depending so much on us that we dictate the terms to you. It's not that you're dictating the terms to us. And that significance was not lost on Russia. Russians were thinking, we're giving these guys everything at our own expense. And it's coming also at the expense of our geopolitical influence. Just look at Syria. Look at Syria. And then the second thought that came into the mind of many Russian analysts was, God help us if we let this happen in the Caucasus with the so-called Zangezur corridor.
Well, so, Pietro, I wanted to quickly connect what you said a little bit earlier, where the Eurasian Economic Union and Iran have really one border, and that happens to be the border at Mehri between Armenia and Iran, and that is essentially the same land as the so-called Zangezur corridor that that Turkey and Azerbaijan are trying to realize. So you can see that one of the reasons why they want to make that an extraterritorial demand on Armenia is to be able to block Armenia and Russia from Iran and Iran from the north, basically.
Yeah,
right?
Definitely. Yeah, that's the idea. Also, you have to think of something else, and this is not lost on the Russians either. Despite all the coziness that maybe Russia wants to kind of lure Aliyev to its side or whatever, you have to think Aliyev has been for decades developing relations with forces that are extraordinarily hostile to Russia. We're talking about the American neoconservatives. We're talking about the military-industrial complex of the United States, the Israeli lobby in the United States,
and the UK.
Big oil, and the UK. Yeah, the UK, certainly the UK, and UK even more in many ways than the US.
So, Pietro, a quick question on this. Why don't Russia and Iran completely bypass this troubled area, let's say the Transcaucasus, and lay their pipelines either through, or their railways through Turkmenistan, for example, or even straight through the Caspian?
I actually think that if they did it through, the Caspian, logistically, this is a little bit more difficult, but through Turkmenistan, that I think would actually be a brilliant idea, because you have to think the geography is rather flat.
Mhm.
And also those governments there, Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan, because it would have to go up through Turkmenistan, then to Kazakhstan. That those are countries that are
They're not
fairly
heavily polarized against
they're not
Russia or
polarized
Iran.
or Iran. They're not polarized against. They're not against Russia or Iran.
Mhm.
They're very mellow, and they would be really open to that cooperation. Plus, if you are Russia and Iran and you devote an entire article of your comprehensive strategic partnership treaty to the Caspian, and you want to prevent that Trans-Caspian pipeline, and you want to get the Turkmen away from that pipeline, then what do? You bring Turkmenistan closer to you, right? And this is what my position is. I think that why waste your time with Azerbaijan or Armenia in this case? I think with Azerbaijan is also again this idea that it's like the shortest route between Dagestan and Iran's northern provinces. That it's the shortest route between Russia and Iran. But frankly, I think the Turkmen Kazakh connection would be probably the most beneficial. And in the long term, it would help lock in those Central Asian countries and kind of keep them away from these Trans-Caspian projects that are really being pushed in the West very aggressively by these, like I said, neoconservative, kind of movement, neoconservative intellectuals, if we can call them that, and also, like I said, big oil. Certainly, they're still interested in this. And in some ways, for them, the Ukraine situation emphasized this. It underscored it for them because the idea was to make Europe less energy dependent on Russia, right? And their ultimate aim would be to undermine Russian authority in Central Asia and in Europe at the same time. They want to do both. And Azerbaijan is critical as a link to that. And as much as we might think, why is Aliyev so disrespectful to Putin? Is it because he wants concessions? Well, also look at the Azerbaijani school textbooks. Look at the ideology, the national ideology in Azerbaijan that's being promoted. It's very Russophobic. I've actually heard from some Russian commentators that the school textbooks in Azerbaijan, with regard to Russia, are worse than those of Latvia, right? And so this is not something that would go away just in 2 years because Pashinyan decides to pivot to the EU or to the US. This is something that has been developing over decades. This is a national ideology that Aliyev has developed over the last few decades. It's not going to go away overnight. If anybody believes that, then they're delusional. It's just like believing that I can bring Turkey out of NATO and into my orbit. Well, Turkey is integrated into the Western military structure, not only militarily, but ideologically. They've been taught for decades.
Something like that would take decades.
Yeah, no, they've been taught for. I mean, they've been ideologically conditioned for decades to hate the commies, to hate the Russians, and that's not going to just change overnight. It's not going to change overnight. That's the reality. And Turkey is the favorite instrument of the West to get to the Caspian.
So you mentioned Ukraine. Let's turn our attention to Russia's Western Front, where the war in Ukraine continues. And Trump has returned to the White House with a flurry of pronouncements threatening to impose tariffs, taxes, sanctions against Russia if Putin doesn't end the war. Now, both presidents, Trump and Putin, have said that they are ready to meet in person and discuss Ukraine and ending the conflict. And Putin, in addition, has called for renewed talks on disarmament. That's just to up the ante for these talks. Meanwhile, amid increased diplomatic engagement between Russia and the US, the UK and Ukraine have signed a 100-year partnership pact. I guess we're not going to see the end of that pact. Maybe this is also one reason why former Foreign Minister Lavrov has said yesterday that he's not seeing any will or movement on the part of Ukraine to really end this conflict. So what is your assessment of the diplomatic activity, this flurry of diplomacy to stop the war? By the way, how serious do you think is Trump, and how seriously is Trump taken in Russia?
Well, that second question is particularly very interesting because when we talk about the Russian street with regard to Trump, there is a kind of there is a perception that the U.S. is in a complete chaos right now with Trump. Even with the inauguration, the commentary was, I would ask Russians, because they were watching what was going on too very closely, because this matters for them. You have to think that what happened was under the Joe Biden, the departure of Biden is of amazing. It's of not really amazing. It's of immense significance because Biden was the one who created this international anti-Russian framework. This whole idea of trying to isolate Russia internationally, right, over Ukraine. And actually, really, Biden instigated the Ukraine conflict. When we talk about who started the war, we were on this podcast. We have a whole archive of episodes where you and I were talking, and Hovik is on there too. I mean, that all three of us are
since 2021.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In 2021, we were talking almost every day about how the UK and the US are provoking Russia into a war in Ukraine. And so the idea that Russia just invaded in a completely unprovoked way, it's completely disingenuous to say that. To say nothing also of the fact that UK, kind of continues this with Boris Johnson flying in. But I digress on that point. Anyway, the point is that Biden, this is a president who created this whole anti-Russian international framework. And now what the Russians perceive is that this international framework is collapsing. It already began to collapse even before Trump came in. Mm-hmm. But it seems to be really in its death throes. And in addition to that, you have this President Trump, who is really wild, who's making all sorts of, like as you noted, these wild proclamations about Greenland and Mexico and Canada and, the 51st state and so on and so forth, the Panama Canal. And to the Russians, they're just like saying, well, we're going to get our popcorn and watch the show. I mean, it's that crazy,
Well, I have to say, Pietro, it's not as crazy as the first Trump administration. Seriously, when he took over in 2017, it was absolute chaos and kind of stayed chaotic for 4 years. But this time around, there seems to be a certain deliberate energy to the whole thing. I mean, he's a lot more. Well, I guess after 8 years, he's had a lot of political experience, and I feel like he's got a sense of direction. So I'm not entirely sure exactly what he wants out of. I mean, he talks about wanting to have a deal about Ukraine. I'm not sure what kind of a deal that Trump wants that Russia can also accept. Do you think that Russia would ever accept to a Ukraine that can be part of NATO? Ever?
No, never, ever. It would never happen. What Russia wants, and what the Russians are open to certainly, is a big deal. Mm-hmm. A kind of a deal that would be almost like a kind of a Yalta conference style deal, where Russia and the U.S., basically we're talking about Trump and Putin, basically decides what hemisphere is the U.S. going to be in, what hemisphere is Russia going to be in, where does Europe factor into all that, what's China's position on this, and so on and so forth. It'd have to be like a big deal, basically determining where NATO ends, where NATO expansion ends, which ideally for the Russians would be at the border between Poland, even in Ukraine. I mean, that they don't want Ukraine in NATO at all. They keep on emphasizing it now, certainly. Now, Zelensky, we know he has this idea that maybe we can give, so Russia has controls now, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donbass, most of Donbass. They have Crimea, as we know. They've had Crimea for quite some time. Now, Zelensky says, maybe I can just give up these territories temporarily to Russia, like loan them to Russia, and that if we have over 200,000 peacekeepers to keep the peace, including U.S. troops and NATO troops, and that would also be a good solution. But Russia's never going to accept
how likely is that?
That's never going to work. That's not going to work. But the big thing is that most likely it's U.S. by rights, in terms of its natural interests. The U.S. really has no real stake in Ukraine. I mean, really, it's not a bread and butter issue for most Americans.
It's not a bread or butter, but if you listen to the UK and also the US, they talk about trillions in mineral resources and things like that they think are in Ukraine. Somebody, I can't remember, but it was from neocon quarters that it was coming, that there are approximately $7 trillion of wealth in Ukraine.
Yeah. This is also, by the way, and when you mentioned about neocons, it's also a concern for the Russians because they're hoping, again, for more of peace from Trump. And the thing is that they're also seeing a lot of neocon appointees in this administration too, like Marco Rubio, let's say. And they get worried that, how sincere is he? Well, it's not that they're worried. It's that they also say, well, we've seen this show before. Does U.S. foreign policy really change from administration to administration? But there are some people in Trump's administration who actually are talking more kind of in the language of, peace. So we have, for instance, Elbridge Colby. You also have somebody like Musk. Elon Musk, who talks about he's supporting Trump, at least on this idea of ending the wars. Right now, Musk is another character who's really kind of out there. But you have doves and hawks emerging in this administration, and it remains to be seen who is going to, be I guess you could say, the victor in all this. People are taking bets right now, not only in Russia, but in the United States. What is the direction, geopolitical direction of this administration? I mean,
I'm kind of
where are they
interested
going to
in knowing of all these nominees and the cabinet coming in, who is for war and who is for peace, actually. And
Absolutely.
just today, I think, or was it yesterday, that Pete Hegseth got nominated, what's the term I'm looking for? Nominated, I guess,
Confirmed?
for confirmed. Thank you.
Confirmed, yeah, confirmed, yeah.
Confirmed as defense secretary. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
I
I
mean,
mean, Hovik, do you have anything to add on this? I mean, because it's an interesting
no, I think
discussion.
that it's just it's interesting, but my own opinion is that there's still an overwhelming amount of hawks in the cabinet,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
if Trump is the one, like previously before the inauguration, we're coping with these hawks or some were coping by saying, well, still Trump has a last word. And now we're seeing all these, BS statements from Trump regarding, I'm gonna sort of, sorry, Russians, I love Russians, but I'm gonna, destroy your country if you don't, agree to a peace. And then, like, the numbers he's quoting, for instance, he's saying that on inauguration day, he said there are 1 million Russians and 700,000 Ukrainians have died in the war.
Yeah, that makes me seriously question who is advising
Yeah.
him.
Where is he
Yeah,
getting
who's
these
advising the
numbers?
guy?
He's either knows the truth and is deliberately playing dumb, which is worse, I think, in some cases, or he's completely clueless and he's being fed all this disinformation, and
Absolutely.
it seems he's easily controlled that way. And let me just, since we talked about numbers, let me also mention that we interviewed Ivan Kachanovsky on our show, and his numbers, we can agree to disagree on them, but his numbers are Ukrainian losses amount to 140,000 and Russian losses are at 85,000. Definitely makes much more sense because
Yeah.
I think that if 1 million Russians had died, then that would mean that 4 million Russians would have been wounded. Like the ratio is 1 to 4. And that means that Russians would be out of fighting forces because I don't know how many million people they have, males of fighting age, who can fight. So
Also, you have to think that figure of 100, that figure of a million Russians casual. That's just
I think he actually
astronomical,
said a
and
million soldiers,
a
if I
million
remember.
soldiers. But
Yeah.
that's crazy. And the thing is that you also have to think that if that was really the case, not only would you see a lot of people who are wounded, you would also see a lot of widows. You would see a big social impact. And I live in Russia. I mean, I teach in St. Petersburg. I would be seeing that, and I have not seen anything like that. Actually, frankly, the figures that Kachanovsky cites, which is 85,000, that actually seems to be most likely. I mean, given what I see in Russia, because I don't see this is a war that is deeply impacting. I mean, this is not like a war that is impacting every other person.
Yeah. By the way, those numbers are from early December when we talked to Kachanovsky.
yeah, which is still
Well,
fresh. So
it's still very fresh, yeah. But I think in terms of where he's going to go, I mean, I have a good friend, James Carden, who is a former employee of the State Department, and he's been, actually quite critical of Nicole Pashinyan and his foreign policy orientation. And actually, James is extraordinarily, when I talk to him about what do you think is going to happen, he's extraordinarily pessimistic about Trump. And he doesn't think there's going to be any change, frankly, because he's saying, you know what, the hawks, the neocons are so embedded. It's hard to see, what would be different in a scenario like this. I think also Trump is trying to take some of that energy and direct it to North America, because he understands that this is this imperialism and this kind of aggressive, military attitude is so widespread in DC that he's hoping I can take that energy and direct it someplace else. There is also, I think, a belief, which is most likely correct, that U.S. is not, I mean, it's a fact, the U.S. is not winning in Ukraine. The Ukrainians are not winning in Ukraine. It's a terrible situation for Ukraine right now. It's a tragic situation for Ukraine. And yet I think that there's a sense that, you know, we'd be facing a loss, and how do you manage the loss? And maybe if we were to get Greenland, that would be like a compensation, you know, and then everybody would forget about Ukraine, and everybody would think about, oh, look how wonderful I am because I took, you know, I got Greenland. Even if I can't, I mean, I don't necessarily see Trump going in, you know, Iraq style, shock and awe, and taking Greenland, you know, but I do see a scenario potentially where Trump, you know, it would be kind of like what happened with the Panama Canal. Panama was part of Colombia, right?
Yeah.
And the U.S. grandfathered, I mean, it midwifed the independence of Panama. And that's how they got the Panama Canal, because they supported the independence of Panama from Colombia. Now, you could see a similar situation with Greenland, where the U.S., because, you know, there are three voices in this whole Greenland issue. It's not just the Danes and Trump. It's also the Greenlandic people. And the Greenlandic people have made it very clear. We don't want to be Americans. We don't want to be Danes. We want to be, you know, Greenlandic. We want to be our own people.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see a scenario where Trump uses that to his advantage to kind of midwife Greenlandic independence and kind of enhance U.S.
and then have them apply to become a state or something like that.
It could be
because,
something like that.
Because the key thing is that
that would break NATO.
With that,
absolutely, I would definitely. I mean,
look at the poor Danes. Like they're going, you know, Russia bad, you know, Russia evil, Putin evil, and then like, you know, Trump comes.
Well,
from the
that's
other side,
you know, I had that exact
England.
same. You know, I had that exact same thought today when I was having dinner, and I was thinking to myself, you know, my God, it's hard to feel sorry for the Danes because you know they're the ones who hitched themselves so strongly to the American empire in this imperial crusade in Ukraine, and yet, you know, now they're going to have to deal with the fact that the U.S. is calling the shots.
Yeah, that'll
Trump
show them.
wants Greenland, and then, you know.
But
hey,
let me mention one thing. I completely agree with you that the talk of military attack or anything like that is just it's a joke. Okay, that's not going to happen. But for Denmark, Greenland is a net negative on their budget. Okay, it doesn't produce enough, they don't invest enough in it, whatever. If you think about it in those terms, there's possibility of some kind of a deal where it's a win-win. America wants this thing because they're going to just, Elon Musk is going to own Greenland, and he's going to invest hundreds of millions or billions of dollars and just take all of its lithium and put it in his cars, whatever, right? So that would be a win on the American side, and suddenly Denmark wouldn't be burdened with paying for all the social services for 60,000 people out of a country of how many million are they? So something could happen.
Also, increasingly, you know, the Danish subsidies to Greenland are actually, you know, decreasing over the years because the Danish government made an agreement with Greenland. Where basically that, you know, as Greenland exploits more and more of its natural resources, as Greenland becomes richer itself, that you know, that subsidy from Copenhagen will be gradually reduced over time, right? And it's been getting reduced more and more and more. Plus, also there was a big controversy recently with Greenland and Denmark, where there actually was it was revealed that there were forced sterilizations of native women on the island of Greenland by the Danish government. And this is incredibly controversial in Greenland. And so now, before, when the Greenland issue came up in Trump's first term, you mostly heard about Denmark and the United States. Now you're hearing more and more the Greenlandic people speaking out. They're saying more and more that, you know, we don't want anything to do with Denmark. We want to be our own people. We want to be our own country. And you can, again, like I said, you can see a scenario where the U.S. uses that to its advantage. Even if the U.S. in the end doesn't really formally control Greenland, you could see a scenario where they would have Greenland as almost like a part of their sphere of influence in North America.
At this rate, I would let Denmark become a territory of Greenland and then take over.
It's possible. Greenland. And also there's an emotional connection too, because also the Danes, they think about, you know, their history. I mean, there was one point where, you know, there were Norse settlements on the island of Greenland. Mm-hmm. So yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's an interesting situation, interesting dynamic.
So let's leave Denmark for now, and I wanted to ask you. I mean, we talked briefly about it, but what do you think of this 100-year agreement? How seriously should we take it? And obviously, it was crafted, it was timed to be happen right before Trump's inauguration, and the message is pretty loud, but how serious should we take that message?
Message is pretty loud, but at the end of the day, British men and boys are not going to fight in Ukraine. I mean, the British government and the British establishment, maybe they really want to, counter Russia in Ukraine. They really want to send that point home. And so you have this treaty as a consequence. But the treaty itself, again, it's a partnership. It's not an alliance. It doesn't oblige the British army to come to the rescue of Ukraine in case of the worst, in case the worst happens, where like Kiev falls, which could very well happen this year.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is that that's why I don't think we should take it so seriously. I think it's a bunch of, I guess you could say brouhaha, but it's not going to. I don't think it's going to have any necessarily teeth. It's meant to show to the Russians that we mean business, that we want to kind of keep this war going and rah 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 and all that. But at the end of the day, the British are not even. I mean, there of course there's British. There are cases where you have British, fighting in Ukraine, and you also have certainly British intelligence in Ukraine. But it's not like the full British army in Ukraine fighting the Russians, and it's not going to be that. And at the end of the day, Russia has the strategic advantage of Ukraine. I mean, in Ukraine, they have the home field advantage, and the British, they're on an island, they're far away. The geography, it's just like France and Armenia. I hate to bring up that. I mean, I'm going to bring up that issue too. France is never going to come to the rescue of Armenia. And even in history, I mean, we'll look at the fate of poor Kalikia. I mean, I don't have to go into that history too deeply, but the geography matters so much. Russia's right next door to Ukraine. Only Pashinyan. Well, Pashinyan, I think he has to be. I mean, I think I'm going to be quite frank. I think that he's a foreign agent. He's working for somebody else.
Pietro,
And yeah, I mean,
what's the significance of all these treaties, the Russian-Iranian, and then the UK, Ukraine, all these treaties that are getting signed right before Trump came to office? Is it like, does anybody think that they're going to force Trump's hand into a fait accompli or something like that? Because he's never shown any penchant to caring about these things.
I think that was maybe the calculation from the UK point of view, that they thought that this treaty would help maybe pressure Trump to continue in Ukraine the way that Biden has. But I think actually what we have now, a significant difference between Biden and Trump, is less of a commitment to keep up this war. Now, maybe Trump might want to, freeze the war. Maybe there might be this idea among his administration that we should freeze the conflict or something. But Russia, again, made it clear that they don't want to freeze. They're not going to freeze this and then come back in 10 years and fight again. They want to end this decisively. And no NATO for Ukraine. But when it comes down to Russia and Iran, this is, of course, it's necessary. I mean, it is in a way to kind of preempt Trump, but it's also, I think, designed to kind of. First of all, you have to think of it like this: this treaty was long in the works. There were some delays. The Iranian side admitted that actually they had caused the delays, but at the end of the day, the treaty was really codified on paper what Iranian-Russian relations have become in the last 10 to 20 years. That's really what we're looking at fundamentally at the end of the day, and specifically Russian-Iranian relations in the last 5 years. I think that putting it right before Trump coming into office was also a signal, because we also know that Trump is very close to, Bibi Netanyahu. He's close to Israel. So it's also intended to be a signal to not only the incoming American administration, but also to Israel that, we mean business here. Russia has, it's not a formal military alliance, but Russia will definitely, be supporting Iran. So I think that there is that significance. Also, something else about Trump I just wanted to throw out. He has this proclamation. I don't know how realistic it would be, but he says I'm going to end the wars. Well, we'll wait and see what happens there. We're going to wait and see what happens with the ceasefire in Gaza. How long that holds, because Netanyahu, like I said in another podcast, is a tough customer, and he benefits from keeping the war going, keeping the wars going, and he's long had an interest in war against Iran, and also he's buddies with Aliyev, and we know Aliyev's interest there too.
Speaking of Netanyahu, Trump so far has, I think, not announced any major initiatives towards Iran. However, we know the neocon makeup of his cabinet. How do you assess essentially Trump's posture towards Iran, and what can we expect?
I think he's under pressure, of course, to take a more aggressive stance from Israel. You're already hearing statements. I'm going to put pressure on Iran in forms of sanctions and everything. Now, I'm not sure how effective that's going to be, because big part of this treaty between Russia and Iran is about kind of mutual support against sanctions, also to create an alternative to SWIFT. This is big news, right? Mm-hmm. This is where again, in what I called earlier on another podcast on your show, the rise of the rest. Right, and this treaty is another reflection of that, right? Russia, Iran, India, China, they're on
another reflection is BRICS, basically.
BRICS is that's exactly what I mean. Mm-hmm. And so I think that he can try to put maximum pressure on Iran, but I think that Iran is going to, like the Frank Sinatra song goes, they're going to go my own way. They're going to go their own way. I mean, they're not going to pay much heed to this. And
that with an Iranian accent, that would be really nice to
hear. and a Persian accent, and I think that when it comes down to it, when we talk about the axis of resistance against Israel in light of the events in Gaza and everything like that, there is this idea. Certainly, Syria for Russia and Iran was a major setback, but it's interesting because Hezbollah does not seem to be completely out of the game. Iran somehow has been able to kind of continue to support Hezbollah despite Syria being knocked out, and despite HTS, being on the rise, despite Turkey and Israel basically dividing the spoils or fighting over the spoils in Syria. And also you have the Houthis too. And then in addition, you have the Russia-Iran comprehensive strategic partnership. So all those factors together, I mean, Iran, and there have been also analyses that, could, Iran end up the way of Syria? Because, Syria, we saw what happened. They were under sanctions. The regime buckled. There was a lot of corruption. Assad's army did not back him up, and the state really collapsed there in Syria. And there have been, some questions among some Middle Eastern experts. There have been some, speculations. Would this happen to Iran? And I don't think it would happen to Iran. Iran as a state is much stronger, and also they control their own energy resources. So one difference with Syria that's quite significant is that the Syrians, the Americans were controlling the oil. And that really was a huge problem for the Syrian budget, at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. Iran doesn't have that issue. And also you have to think Iran's a huge country. It's like I said in my analysis, it basically covers most of the historical Iranian plateau. It is, I mean, we know the Armenian plateau, there's the Iranian plateau. And it's the size of Mongolia. It's a huge country. It's not Iraq. It's certainly not Syria.
Right.
And it's not just going to fall. If anybody expects that, then that's ridiculous. It's not going to happen. So Iran, at the end of the day, it's going to withstand this. And I think it may remain to be seen what happens on the nuclear option. The Iranians, they would prefer to. Iran doesn't want war. They want peace. Right now, there might be some people, who want to have war against Iran, but the Iranians themselves have no desire to have a major regional war. Netanyahu does. He wants to use, all these fronts as an excuse to go to war. But the Iranians themselves do not want war.
Well, let's hope that it doesn't come to that, as Trump says, and let's hope that at least we see some respite in these years of war. But we'll continue monitoring the news, and we'll continue bringing you guests like Pietro, who can help us decipher all these treaties and what's going on in the region. Thank you, Pietro.
Thank you, Hovik. Merci, Chat. Hajo.
That's our show today. This episode was recorded on January 25, 2025. We've been talking with Dr. Pietro Shakarian, who is a historian of Russia and the Soviet Union and a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Historical Research at the National Research University, Higher School of Economics in St. Petersburg, Russia. So for more information on all of the participants in this episode, check out our show notes at podcast.groong.org/episode number. I'm Asbed Bedrossian.
And I'm Hovik Manucharyan.
Follow us on social media everywhere you get your Armenian news. The links are going to be in the show notes, podcast.groong.org/episode number.
Don't forget to drop us a comment. Let us know how we're doing.
We love to read your comments.
Thanks for listening and talk to you soon.